Hi, I'm Dean Turda, and this is my model railroad, the Cape Cod and New Bedford. My railroad is set in 1950 to 53-ish, with small exceptions, and I've tried to make it look what I can find there from photographs at the time. You'll notice that despite the time period being in the 1950s, that it's all dieselized. That's because the New Haven Railroad was the first Class 1 railroad in the United States to fully dieselize. So I've reflected that in my layout and the locomotives that I've used. So we're here in Provincetown with the tower in the background, the tallest granite tower in the United States that is still there to these days, the Plymouth Monument. The house that is there I have pictures of in the late 1800s. I've tried to create the street and the freight house as it was. I actually have a picture of this little scene with a red bus and a yellow taxi.
Tell us a little bit about the background of this scene here, Dean.
It's one of my favorites. It's a laser cut building and a plastic building that I've weathered a lot, and an Atlas tower that I've cut down tremendously. I liked in the photograph, I noticed that the water tower was about 8 feet off the fellow's eaves trough. Now here's something you don't see very often in Western Canada, a layout in the eastern United States with sand dunes. So I tried to reproduce Truro here, which is the ocean going to a little bit of beach and an old road, followed by the swamp and the sand dunes about a mile away, and then there's nothing until you get to Portugal. One of my favorite scenes is in Wellfleet. I've taken the pond there and the railroad crossing, which was built in the late 1800s and replaced not long after with a slight realignment. So there's quite a few pictures here of the pilings of the old bridge, which don't seem to be aligned in any order at all that you would think would normally be part of a bridge. And they moved it over a couple of feet, and it pretty well looks that way right down to the beige and bluish ballast, which I was able to reproduce. But I've had fun doing it. What I represent is the single line trackage in the Southeast Massachusetts area below the main lines from New York to Boston. We've moved now to the town of Orleans and the fuel distributor and garden center that exists there. I've tried to represent them in compact form along with other parts of the town, the old inn and hotel. The hotel is made of card and was far too large in scale. One of the nice things about making card models is that you can just reproduce a print at 70% and scale it properly to the scene that you're trying to recreate. Luck and friends have a lot to do with model railroading. This unfinished scene represents just north of Hyannis, where there are two very visible water tanks. Fortunately, somebody parked a Ford F-150 in front of one of them while the Google satellite was going by, and he worked out the dimensions of the two tanks for me, which I then reproduced. In the front is a little fire hydrant, and honest to goodness, at the bottom of this 40-foot hill in a state forest, as far as I can tell, is a red and white fire hydrant. I have no idea why. This was a tight scene to do, but I think I've got the major elements of a scene that's not too different today. The locomotive on the old steam cinder pit. There was an ice house of some sort, a very short and squat water tank, in fact the squattest I've seen, a roundhouse that I had fun making from scratch and pretty well represents the photographs I can find as best as possible, right down to the fallen fascia, the oil tank and the pickup truck beside it. I was very fortunate to have a good friend offer to make this bascule bridge for me. It was a feature of the Cape Cod Canal, built up very early on, and it's not just a tilt-up bridge, it sort of folds up. My mother actually told me about it when she saw it as a young girl. It looked like a giant praying mantis rising into the sky, and I'm very pleased to be able to have it on my layout. Part of the reason that I modeled this area of Massachusetts is because this is where I vacationed as a young boy from, well, the time I was born until I was 24 years old in the summers. I'm representing here the bridges just across the bay from our cottage, the road bridge and the railroad bridge, which looks a bit odd because it also was repurposed over time. It used to be a lift bridge here, and there's a 34-foot channel, some 50-foot channels, and I've reproduced those as best I can using model railroad parts and a bit of custom work. The featured industry for my layout is, as on the prototype, the cranberry industry, which started in Cape Cod, and they brought trains of about 10 Fruit Growers Express cars into the various warehouses to be loaded on the Cape. My layout is sized to about 7 cars or 4 passenger cars, and all the sidings and accommodations are made with that sort of size of train in mind. I had some luck with this area of the layout. I noticed that a building in each of 2 towns had the same roof profile, so I used one side for the town of Harwich and the other side for the town of West Barnstable, which also serves the cranberry trade. The lumber yard was filled by a friend of mine who offered to make all the stacks of wood to load up the building. I used a mirror in this particular case in order to extend the visual look of the main line, and nice to get a locomotive for free too. In the town of New Bedford, there is a huge factory complex from the last century. I've tried to represent it with this building, for which the width is about right, the height is about right. There certainly is a railroad overpass nearby, but the building that I've made is only a third the length of the actual real building, and furthermore, there are 11 buildings of that size in the town of New Bedford. I've tried to represent a bit of it. The only major city on my layout that is represented is New Bedford, a former whaling town. I've tried to represent the swampy yard, which was built out of really the swamp, with a couple of the grittier buildings and rising hill behind as a backdrop. I really enjoy kit bashing. For this brightly colored house in Wellfleet, I found a nice kit for the house that was about the right size, but what to do for the porch. And then I noticed this model in the store of the top of a signal tower, and suddenly I had my answer. The layout is 2 levels of track in HO scale, about 450 feet in total. I have a mix of freight and passenger traffic and run the railroad using JMRI to generate manifests for my trains. I can have 3 or 4 operators at a time, pretty well fully employed for about a 2.5-hour operating session.